The first characteristic we have that distinguishes the domain bacteria from the domain archaea and eukarya were that their cell membrane and their cell wall were reinforced. That helps the archaea do what that you learned in the video that these guys can do that these guys can't. Really, yes, really hot is one of them. Where else? What other kinds of environments?
Like low or high pressure.
Uh-huh. The events. What else? What else? There are a couple. You have very hot. You have very high pressure. About the ocean. What's in the ocean?
So underwater. Like inland.
What's in the ocean that's not an Indian Lake? Salt. Very salty environment, and also very acid environments. They can live in places you wouldn't think anything would because of this reinforced cell wall and cell membrane. The next group branches off the eukarya because all of a sudden now we have membrane-bound organelles. We're going to be learning a little bit more about those in the next couple of days as well. How did they get those organelles, and how are they unique? So they have membrane-bound organelles. Remember, in the archaea and the bacteria, the DNA was just loose and floating around. They didn't really have any membranes other than wrapping around the outside of them. They didn't have mitochondria or chloroplasts. So no membrane-bound organelles. So that gave us then some unicellular individuals, mostly, okay? And from unicellular, they started to, some of the protists started living together in a colony. And sometimes those colonies, certain cells got specialized to do different things. One of them produced more food, one of them provided shelter. Until finally, they found it advantageous to be multicellular. I can't write today, it's Monday. Okay. And then from multicellular, we got a common ancestor where plant-like things branched off from fungi and animals. And one of those branches had chlorophyll. Okay. And they were known as autotrophs. What does it mean to be an autotroph? What does it mean to be an autotroph? Anybody know? Who knows? Really, you don't know? Yeah, they can make their own food. Okay. Then, from the next branch that we had here, okay, between the fungi and the animals, we had another node or another common ancestor. And the fungi branched off on the left because they had their cell wall, which the other plants all had. They have a cell wall which also contained a really hardened protein named chitin. So the fungi had a cell wall made of chitin. And the animals developed specialized tissue. They had no cell walls. So in fungus, they have all the same kind of cells, mostly, and they just divide up into different patterns. Like for mushroom, like a stem, and then a cap, and then the little paper-like things that are under the mushroom stem, that mushroom cap. They don't have much specialized tissue, if at all, and animals do. So here's your cladogram, and here's where bacteria, the archaea, and the protists belong in this hierarchy. You okay with that? Okay. So I'm going to categorize their characteristics a little bit more for you. And to do that, you're going to want another sheet of paper. You're going to want to turn it sideways. And on that paper, we're going to want to make like columns. We're going to make a column for each of these guys, where we're going to write some stuff in them. So another sheet of paper, turn it sideways. We're going to label this with each of the different categories across the top. Start with bacteria. And you're going to do 6 of them. Okay. We're going to label them with their characteristics. So we're going to go from our cladogram backwards to a chart of characteristics. Remember before, we started with a chart and then we made a cladogram. Now we're going to look at what we can learn from that cladogram that we just looked at, because you need to be able to do both of those things. And organize that. The first thing we want to look at is, are they prokaryotes or eukaryotes? And bacteria are prokaryotes. As are archaea. Everybody else is a eukaryote. Next thing we're going to look at is, how do they get their food? How do they get their nourishment? You got that one?
I don't know about bacteria, but yeah, I'm just going to say bacteria. The plant use photosynthesis get chlorophyll.
Some bacteria do.
Okay.
Some bacteria do. The ones who use chlorophyll are the cyanobacteria, which they're blue-green algae, and they do photosynthesis, and they actually are responsible for most of the oxygen that you're breathing right now. Most bacteria are heterotrophs. Archaea are autotrophs. Mostly. They live in the hot springs and they use the chemicals around them to get energy to provide the food that they need, the nutrients that they need. Protists can be both. There are some protists like Euglena and some colonial algae like volvox that do photosynthesis and make their own stuff. Fungi are kind of interesting because they are something called absorptive heterotrophs. Which means that they cannot make their own food. They don't eat, though. They just absorb the things they need from around them. That's why you'll see mushrooms growing in certain places in the yard. There are certain nutrients in that lawn that they can absorb and use. They might be growing in a tree because they're using nutrients that they absorb from this decaying log, this decaying tree, or a live tree. Plants are autotrophs. And animals are heterotrophs. We can't stand out in the sunlight and get our lunch. So, unicellular or multicellular, which are which? Get your chart. You'll be able to find from your chart who's unicellular and who's multicellular.
Bacteria, archaea, and protists are all single.
Okay.
And multicellular are fungi, plants, and
Everybody over to here is unicellular, starting here, multicellular fungi. So then we're going to take a look at reproduction. How do they reproduce? This part that wasn't on your cladogram, we're going to add this part to them. So bacteria reproduce asexually, as do archaea and protists. The cell just splits. The DNA, the big circular DNA, just divides in half, and then the cell just splits. When we get to Protista, we sometimes find that they can kind of bond together, they can exchange their DNA, and then you get a slightly different individual when you're done. In bacteria and archaea, we get exactly the same DNA, exactly the same individual when we're done, unless there's a mutation, which is how we got everything else. And so Protista can do something called conjugation, where they can kind of couple up with another of their own species, and they can exchange some DNA, and then they split apart, and then each one will split, so that individual offspring are not exactly alike. Fungi can do both asexual and sexual reproduction. Okay, as can plants. Animals reproduce strictly by sexual reproduction. We need an egg and a sperm, and DNA gets combined, rearranged, mixed, and you get offspring that are slightly different. Genetic recombination, mutations, all those things are why you don't look exactly like the rest of your family or your parents. Unless you're an identical twin, or beginning you are, I mean. So let's take a look at whether they have a cell wall or not. This is important. Okay. Bacteria have a cell wall. Archaea have a specialized reinforced cell wall. Okay. Protists do not have a cell wall. Fungi have a cell wall that has chitin in it. Do plant cells have cell walls? Plants have cell walls? Some nodding, so here's some yeses, they do. And they are made out of, do you remember what? Do we have cellulose? We can't digest cellulose. We consider it to be fiber in our diet. We can't digest it. Termites can digest it because they have specialized bacteria in their intestines or in their gut. Termites don't really have intestines, they just have a gut. And those bacteria can break it down. Cellulose is a specialized carbohydrate that we can't digest. Okay? It's a kind of starch. And animals, do we have cell walls? We don't have any. Okay. And let's look at a fun fact about each one of these. Okay. Bacteria can either cause disease or be beneficial. Okay. Archaea are considered extremophiles. They live where nothing else can live. I went into Yellowstone Park, a bit out west. Seen pictures of Yellowstone. Most of the things that cause the different colors in those hot springs are colorful bacteria that bloom, and that's why you see the beautiful yellow and red and orange, and it is pretty amazing. Okay. And who has chloroplasts? What's chloroplast? Do animals have chloroplasts? We do not. Plants? Okay. Fungi that have chloroplasts? Nope. What about protists? Some of them. And what is it that animals had from your cladogram that made us different and special? What do we have? What's the last characteristic on your chart, on your cladogram? Last characteristic over there that animals have. So you have two ways now to look at all of these different domains of living things. We're going from one cell, which these guys are made of basically of biomolecules put together in certain formations, like their DNA is made of nucleic acids. Their cell membranes are mostly made of lipids. If they have a cell wall, it can be made of some combination of carbohydrate and proteins for the most part. Archaea have a very, very reinforced cell wall and cell membrane. It has a lot of different proteins. It's thicker, it's bigger, it's harder to penetrate. Protists, if they're plant-like, then they have a cell wall. Some of them have chlorophyll. They're a group that we really have had a lot of trouble trying to categorize because they're so diverse. What they have in common is that they're one cell and that they live in mostly normal environments. They can't live in heat or acid or salt or with a lot of pressure. Some of them can make their own food with photosynthesis. Some of them can do both. Some of them run around and eat other things, but still can make food if they need to. So very strange. On plants, you're pretty familiar with fungi, mushrooms. If you think of mushrooms, I can't remember who it was said on their Friday's assignment that they thought fungi were gross. Okay, and that might be because Hank talked about dog vomit fungi, that they were gross. And I said, do you like mushrooms? And then animals are pretty familiar with our characteristics. We can't make our own food. I don't know if I would like that or not, to be able to go outside and stand in the sun and not have to eat lunch. I like to eat too much. I like to eat too much. Questions on these guys? Okay. I'll set you free to work on your daily activity then. Anything else you need to look at?